Primarily, we are going to do two things today, or three. First, finishing a few more observations about the new classical macroeconomics and rational expectations. And then we're going to say something about another school of thought or another direction in modern macroeconomics that comes as a reaction to rational expectation, or the new classical macroeconomics. That's another term. New classical. That's new Keynesian or new Keynesian theory. Plenty of new things. New Keynesian theory. And finally, there is another highly idiosyncratic and specific school that is called usually the real business cycle theory. Real business cycle theory. They're completely separate from all the rest. We will see that they differ radically from all the rest, including monetarists and Keynesians and neoclassicals and so on. So first, to finish off a few things pertaining to rational expectations. You remember that the last thing that we discussed was how rational expectations about the future inflation rate affect productivity in the short run. And the last case that we discussed was how if the expectations are downward biased in people's expectations of inflation underestimate the future level of inflation, what happens to GDP productivity. And we drew the picture like this to demonstrate the effects in this regular aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework that we used from the very beginning. And you have a long run curve. Here you have the aggregate demand, initial aggregate demand at the beginning, and the short run curve, short run supply curve. At the beginning, you have this initial macroeconomic equilibrium here, and then something happens, inflation will go up, people expect inflation to go up. But the real inflation, the real price level will increase from 0.1 to 0.3 here. So this is the original CPI 1, price level 1 is here, and this is the natural level of productivity associated with that price level. The real demand will go to 0.3 here, the real increase price level associated with the aggregate demand curve number 3 here. But there is an intermediate aggregate demand curve here that is somewhere in between. This is a curve based on the prediction or assessment or expectations that people have. They believe that inflation is going to increase, but that it was going to increase less than it did in reality. So as you can see, this intermediate aggregate demand curve number 2, that's expected. Is associated with a kind of intermediate level inflation with the price level, which is higher than the initial one associated with the equilibrium, but lower than the final one associated with the real, really obtained, really achieved inflation. So now we know from the previous analysis what happens when the aggregate demand increases for whatever reason. When price expectations of a future price level increase, then what happens to the real wage? The real wage expectation of a real wage on the part of workers goes down. That means that people work less. People working less means that they produce less, which means that every increase every shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right is associated with a simultaneous shift of the aggregate supply curve to the left. A reduction. Okay, can you tell me how much, if this is the expectation, if this price level is expected, how much the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left? You reduce, if you expect 5% inflation increase, you reduce the 1.5%. Productivity in the long run goes down 5%. This supply curve has to go to this point too. That's how much people will reduce their work. That's how much the supply curve will shift to the left. Okay. Because this is the level of inflation and the increase in demand that people expect. This is the long-run curve. We know that macroeconomic equilibrium is an intersection of all 3 points, all 3 curves, long and short-run supply curves, and the aggregate demand. So this is the short-run curve number 2, which is actually happening. This is what's going to happen. This is the real reduction in supply that will take place. Now, what is the real demand that takes place? What is the real demand curve here associated with the really truly obtained inflation rate? It's the aggregate demand. Real demand. It's here. Okay. So can you tell me where is the new short-run equilibrium? The intersection of the truly obtained supply curve and the truly obtained aggregate demand curve. That means aggregate demand curve number 3 equals short-run supply curve 2. That's the new short-run equilibrium. What can you tell me about that equilibrium? That would be this point here. It's an inflationary disequilibrium. It's associated with an inflationary gap. QE greater than QN. QN is associated with the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of productivity. Temporary productivity is higher than that. So that cannot stand. What is going to happen is that people will realize that their wages lost part of their value. They're going to reduce working even more in order to make up for this loss here. Say inflation rate increased 4%, people reduce their productivity 2%. That means that their real wage went down actually 2%. So they're going to reduce working even more. So the supply curve will eventually have to shift all the way to this position. So the price will have to increase a bit further and production go down. But if the rational expectations are imprecise in the downward direction, if people underestimate future inflation, that will create temporary inflationary gap here. Yeah, so now it's interesting to compare this situation because they might look similar. Downward biased expectations, underestimations of future inflation, and then no change in expectation happens. Can you describe me where is the short-run equilibrium if no change in expectations is taking place? Demand changed in the exact same manner as here. The price level went from CPI 1 to CPI 3. The demand curve translated from 81 to 83. There is no 82. Expectations have not changed at all. Where is the new temporary equilibrium? And it's always the truly obtained supply curve and truly obtained demand curve. Where's the short-term equilibrium? This supply curve is associated with the previous period of production. That's how much people would provide at any given price level right now. With the price expectations, with inflation expectations, as they are at the beginning of the process. So what's going to happen to this supply curve if inflationary expectations do not shift either up or down? If inflationary expectations go up, what happens to the real wage? Expected real wage. It goes down. It means people work less. That means supply curve shifts to the left, less production. If inflationary expectations are negative, which means people expect deflation, that means they will work more because they expect the real wage to be higher than income to appreciate. If inflationary expectations are zero, nothing will change. We'll have the same rate of inflation as before. What happens to the supply curve? Real and nominal wage are the same. People work as much as they did before. So you have the same supply curve. Supply curve 1 remains in force if no change in inflation is anticipated. So then the short-term equilibrium, where will it be? Yeah. So see, what can you conclude from this? Something very simple. If inflation is more underestimated, this inflationary gap will be bigger. See, Q2 here. If people didn't change their inflationary expectations whatsoever, then they will be working more, of course, because they don't perceive the danger of losing money, of losing income, of losing purchasing power. They work as before, but the prices go up. The real wages go down. So they temporarily produce way more than they would have done otherwise had they predicted accurately the changes in the price level. So although they might seem like graphically when you look at the situations of downward biased expectations and no change in expectations whatsoever, they're different insofar as in the case of no changes in expectations, inflationary gap is bigger. Inflationary gap is bigger. People produce. Here you have a partial offset. You have some shift in the supply curve. Supply curve shifts from 1 to 2. Here you have no supply curve shift whatsoever, and then production temporarily is much higher. Okay. So that's all I got about the rational expectations. Any questions about this? Those 4 cases that you have to bear in mind that when people correctly anticipate what's going to happen, then you have a complete offset. The supply curve shifts instantaneously to this point 3, and there is no gap whatsoever. The only effect of fiscal and monetary policy is an increase in prices. When you have overshooting or overestimation of the price level change, then you have a recessionary gap, and the supply curve shifts more than it's necessary to the left. And then you have recessionary gap, when people underestimate the price level change, and it's an inflationary gap. When no change in expectation occurs in lieu of increased aggregate demand, then you have an even greater inflation than in the third case. Okay, now we're going to move to new Keynesian theory. What is that? New Keynesian theory is an adaptation of the old standard Keynesian theory to the challenge brought about by the new classical macroeconomics. But by this psychological challenge, or subjectivist challenge of macroeconomics. That expectations shape not only how we behave as individuals, but also shape the prospects for economic policy. Messes up macroeconomic policy. Expectations mess up macroeconomic engineering many times. So traditional or old Keynesianism disregarded completely, as we remember, any subjective elements in macroeconomics. They wanted to be scientific, to use those things that we can measure, like employment, inflation, debt, GDP, and so on, all those aggregates that we can measure, to use them to explain everything in the economic system. And to banish, to disregard everything that is subjective, psychological, difficult to quantify, difficult to measure. So, new classical macroeconomics, in particular, led by Robert Lucas and Thomas Sargent, other economists, demonstrated that you cannot do that. That you have to take account of those subjective psychological factors, of values, expectations, preferences, if you want to conduct an efficient macroeconomic policy. And this is a very difficult task. So this is known, this attempt to found or to base macroeconomics on the certain theory about how human person acts, how human person functions in the economy, is known as a project of providing microeconomic foundations for macroeconomics. So microeconomics is this theory about how we make decisions as consumers and producers, what kind of calculations, what kind of estimates we make, and what kind of motivations do we have, and how in practice we make decisions, what expectations we have, how expectations shape our behavior, and so on. This entire psychological element in economics. That is one of the problems with this psychological element, is that it is subjective. And subjective psychological states of mind are much more difficult to measure than the numbers about the number of automobiles that is produced, or the number of quantity of steel that is being made, or the quantity of gold that is dug out from the ground. So it's much more difficult to model and to estimate the data associated with our psychological states of mind. So that's the key, or the stumbling block now in the development of macroeconomics, how to reconcile these two completely, say, disparate worldviews, two disparate ways of looking at society. On the one hand, you have this natural science, physics, technology approach. Measure it. If it matters, measure it. That is one. I used to work for one think tank in Canada for a while, and they had this nice motto: economic think tanks, studying the economy. If it matters, measure it. I said, what if it matters very much, but you cannot measure it? Or you cannot measure it with a sufficient level of precision? What to do then? To say simple things that we cannot measure are irrelevant, or to say maybe we have to satisfy ourselves with a lower degree of certainty in our fields than in physics and chemistry. So, new classical macroeconomics, classical part of new classical macroeconomics was a claim that the markets work. That's the simplest. Markets are self-regulating, and markets are characterized by the flexibility of prices and wages. That's the classical part. The new part of new classical macroeconomics is this specific explanation that they gave. Flexibility of prices and wages was a part of this relatively moral argument. And also this argument about the inefficiency of government intervention. That is a new contribution. This microeconomic criticism of macroeconomics. New Keynesians say, yeah, we have to deal with this, we have to accept that. So that's a big concession that they make. So you're right. Expectations shape not only our behavior, but also the likelihood of efficiency of any given government intervention. Well, that's a big concession, and there's a reason. That's one of the reasons why it is called a new Keynesian theory, because the old Keynesians wouldn't bother with that at all. They would have some plausible assumptions about human behavior, they would model again, and then they wouldn't bother to explore them. So that's the first part. That's the new part of New Keynesian. Keynesian part here is interesting. New Keynesians believe that prices and wages are not perfectly balanced. That's the Keynesian part. Still, sticky wages. Remember that. Prices and wages are not perfectly adjustable. They do not change nearly as fast enough as the trends in the economy would require. Especially, they don't fall fast enough in a situation when the demand for goods and services goes down. Why is that the case? Why the wages are typically considered to be, by Keynesians at least, downward rigid or sticky?
Because like people have contracts with
Yes, people have long-term contracts, and then once you have a contract, it's more difficult to change it than if you adjust the wages on a weekly or monthly basis. Also, you have the trade unions, and even if individuals would like to change the contract, sometimes it's very difficult if you have collective bargaining. Some industries that are unionized, and it's even more difficult to negotiate. So is that a problem? That's a problem because all of those theories here, supply curve shifting, people anticipating or not anticipating, and so on, are predicated upon the idea that wages adjust quickly to changes in the economic conditions. And that's not always the case, according to Keynesians, at least. So that's one part, and we will see all the new Keynesian synthesis, as it is called, sometimes tries to reconcile these two insights that economics achieve. The Keynesian, they deeply believe in this Keynesian view that the markets are not perfectly efficient insofar as the prices and wages are sticky, and that this stickiness of wages prevents the market from adjusting smoothly to the changes in economic conditions. What does that mean? That means that if the demand goes down, if the economic conditions worsen, typically how you can weather the storm was by reducing wages. You can retain full employment by reducing wages. If you cannot do that, for a variety of reasons, long-term contracts of the trade unions, or both of those, and the only way how you can react is by firing some people, by increasing them. Increased unemployment is lower. Okay. So they deeply believe in that claim, and they also believe in rational expectations. They believe that expectations are prospective. They are not adaptive. People are smart. People try to get the best information that they can achieve, that they can acquire. So new Keynesianism takes into account both of these rational expectations, and they can make monetary policy and fiscal policy inefficient. They agree with new classical theory. Now, their singular contribution here is to use certain microeconomic theories to explain additionally why people do not react, why wages do not adjust quickly enough, or why people continue to work more sometimes, even if the information about a higher price increase in the future is available. So that they claim actually that people very often they will keep working, at least many people will continue working much more than it's good for them because they cannot acquire the information that is necessary for them. That might be available in general, but it may not be available to them. So they use a microeconomic theory as the economics of information to show why this happens. And this theory that they use is called information asymmetry. Remember when we discussed at the very beginning of the last lecture, and it was mentioned that you classical macroeconomists believe that you don't need everybody to realize that the inflationary expectations increase. You need just a bunch of experts who work for it, or the interested third parties to realize that, then the information will spread evenly across the entire economic system, and everybody will behave as if they themselves acquire this. The new Keynesians had some doubts about that. Say that the information asymmetry is a theory which says not everybody has an equal access to the information. Some people have, for a variety of reasons, inferior access to information, and they're going to base their actions on this inferior information. And there is no easy and quick way to fix that problem. This process of adjustment is much slower than the rational expectations school assumes it is. As price expectations go up, real wages go down simultaneously. Remember, one curve goes to the right, another goes to the left. You Keynesians say, yeah, that's going to be happening in principle. They're going to be moving in those directions when demand increases and supply will be decreasing, but not as simultaneously and as smoothly as you believe they would. Because the information about on which everything is based, the entire process is based, information about future price increases will not penetrate the entire economic system at the same time, with the same degree of acuteness, with the same degree of completeness. So then you will have certain lags, you will have certain halfway adjustments that they're going to have. Because information is imperfect, and the way how information is spread and utilized in society will make those adjustments take more time. So they use technically here this theory of information asymmetry was developed by two economists. You don't have to remember that; it's not that important. Just to give you the illustration that they themselves also try to and turn the tables on the new classical macroeconomics. Say we have our own microeconomics here. You have your own like utility analysis and these rational expectations. We have some guys, Joseph Stiglitz and David Axelrod, for example, who developed this theory about the informational inefficiency of the markets. This information, this asymmetric access to information that may make markets inefficient. They lead to market failure. So this can help explain certain things in macroeconomics as well. So adjustment will not be as quick and as swift and convincing as is in the conventional rational expectations story. One more thing about this new Keynesian stuff. This is a very strange school of thought insofar as when you look at what they believe, what kind of policy they recommend, it's pretty much monetarist policy. They don't believe in fiscal policy. These are the Keynesians who think that for reasons we don't have either time, not need to go into right now, they don't believe that fiscal policy works. They believe that monetary policy is much better. And ideologically, they're not on the left either at all. That's also right. So one of the main quintessential representative of this school of thought is a Professor Greg Mankiw of Harvard. You might have heard about him if you've taken courses with my predecessor at this university. Sometimes teaches online. And now he uses his textbook. The guy who wrote the textbook Principles of Economics, both macro and micro, which is #1 bestseller, the best sold textbook in the history of the world. Professor of economics, and he has a blog that's a very widely read blog. It's called Greg Mankiw. statistical. The guy names his own work with his own, being complicated things. An important thing about this guy is that he's pretty free market, pretty much pro free market. Among other things, he was the chief. The chief of the Council of Economic Advisors of George W. Bush. And he was also advisor of Donald Trump. He didn't like Trump for other reasons, but ideologically and economically, he was pretty much in the same way. So he's a kind of Republican Paul Krugman. If you know who Paul Krugman is, the main Keynesian economist who is widely regarded highly regarded, I should say, by the Democrats and the liberal democratic elites. Greg Mankiw is his Republican counterpart. He's a new Keynesian in terms of his theory. So new Keynesians essentially believe that the stuff is serious, anti-recessionary policy, we should be careful about it, we should be skeptical about fiscal policy, we should do some monetary policy, but things are not nearly as bleak as Robert Lucas Jr. and Thomas Sargent said there. There is some room, some space for macroeconomics. Just to illustrate what I mean by this, how this works. I know you were overjoyed, more graphs. So, as expected, the same. I hope you don't dream. Graphs. So, the basic stuff, number one possibility that we discussed, that everything is correctly predicted. That people correctly guess the future inflation rate. So that's how you work as a scientist. You take your opponent and you take his or her strongest case, and then you say even I can refute your strongest case. So they don't want to bother with those kind of partially predicted, imperfect, overshooting, undershooting. Say, let's assume this idea of complete and successful prediction. So what happens in the rational expectations version of the argument? You have initial aggregate demand, you have the supply curve at the beginning, you have an increase in inflationary expectations from point 1 to point 2. This is new aggregate demand curve. People perfectly foresee this. And so you're not going to deceive us, you're not going to rip us off by higher prices, we're not going to work more, we're going to reduce our labor hours. The supply curve shifts to the left. In the same time, you have a simultaneous move of the demand curve to the right and the supply curve to the left. And the only effect here is that the price level goes up. Nothing else changes because those two processes are by and large simultaneous. It's not like the first demand increases and you have inflationary gap and people say, oh, sure, I should reduce my labor hours, and then you have a recession. And it's flip-flop this, must flip-flop this, boom, bust. It's like, no, you have just a smooth increase, a slow increase in the price level, nothing changes in the real market. That's new classical market. Mankiw and the crew say, well, no, that's not what's going to happen, because people will assume, or even if they correctly predict what is going to happen. Not everybody will equally correctly predict what is going to happen. So then, you will have some shift, you will have some move of the supply curve to the left. So some expectations, some inflationary expectations are going to materialize, but not all of them. Not everybody will move at the same space, at the same pace. Remember this, information asymmetry, not everybody has the equal access to the best possible information. Some people will underestimate the level of inflationary pressures. So on average, what is to be expected in a situation like this is that this short-term curve will move slightly to the left, but not all the way to this optimal point too. We have this middle supply curve. It will represent this partial adjustment, this partial offset that's going to happen on the market. And then your equilibrium point, short-term equilibrium point here, this. So you will end up, even if some people, that's the new Keynesian syllogism is some people correctly predict future inflation rate. A correct prediction spreads evenly over the entire society, and everybody reduces their productivity in order to adjust to this correct expectation. New Keynesian interpretation is some people will correctly anticipate inflation, but some people will not, and there is no guarantee that the correct prediction will win out. With some people it will, with many people it may not. As a consequence of that, you can expect that the supply curve will not move to this optimal point over here, to point 2, but it will be stuck somewhere around here, and you will have some recession. You will have then some recession. Once everything is said and done, the short-term adjustment is done, the effects of monetary policy are exhausted, you will end up in this type of situation here. People will realize that the price level increased, their nominal income hasn't changed, but their real wages decreased. What they do when they realize this, reduce output. So then you will have a reduction of output from 0.3 to 0.2. A small recession is a consequence of this. In the new classical version, you don't have a recession. You have just a smooth continuation of whatever was going on before, with an increase in price level. You have no, like the counters, you have no cyclical, monetary policy has no cyclical properties, but it doesn't have also, it doesn't have the stimulating properties either. Nothing changes, productivity remains with choice. Here you will have slightly higher inflation, slightly higher productivity for a while, and then you will have an even higher prices in the lower production because of recession. So you will end up in the same, at the same point, just with one additional intermediate step. You have this temporary stimulus and a temporary recession. Okay, so this theory was popular. Some people even say it was the dominant orthodoxy. I wouldn't go that far. It was very popular between 1990s and 2008. And it was perceived as being friendly to, let's say, an approach that says, don't push too hard, don't stimulate too hard, be careful, be cautious. In principle, they share the view that the central bank should infuse the money supply here or there, but there was a big concern about not overdoing stimulus, not overdoing the increases in money supply and so on. Now, 2008 happened with the financial panic crisis that was playing on all kinds of things, all kinds of culprits, including the free market and financial markets, and of course, economic theory. Whatever economic theory was the order of the day, it would be blamed if something as bad as the financial panic of 2008 happens. And the new Keynesian thinking was kind of went out of fashion, and the old Keynesian not back into the picture. Fiscal intervention. More is the better. Quantitative easing. Sky is the limit. The Federal Reserve System started buying not only short-term government bonds, which is the usual way how you increase money supply. You buy a certain quantity of short-term government bonds. They started buying 10 years bonds. 20 years. So trillions of dollars. Fine. So you see, the new Keynesian theory is a kind of complicated, eclectic theory that combines elements of new classical rational expectations and the old Keynesian thinking. And even, as you see, some monetarist arguments. That's a Keynesian theory that believes that in principle monetary policy might be more efficient than fiscal policy. Okay, the last thing for today and for this week is something called real business cycle theory. These guys are different because they don't believe that any demand side factor is instrumental in bringing about recessions. Demand side means anything having to do with spending of money. They believe that the supply side, something pertaining to production, to the productive side of the economy, is creating disturbances. It's creating economic dislocations that cause eventual recessions. This theory came into being in 1970s, and it shouldn't shock you that it became popular in 1970s, because in 1970s we had the first big recession in early 1970s that was caused by a supply shock. That supply shock was the shutting down of the Middle Eastern oil in the United States. At that time, we were much more reliant on Middle Eastern oil, and they, as a consequence of the Israeli-Arab war, they simply imposed an embargo on exporting oil to the West, and there was a big recession, a big economic hit to the American economy. I said, you see, there might be a pattern here, that not only oil shocks, but other shocks, technological shocks, or maybe natural disasters, or something having to do with the productive side of the economy, with the supply side of the economy, might be the real culprit behind recessions and problems in the economy that we only perceive as being demand driven. That's the idea. So you have Keynesians who believe recessions are caused by insufficient spending. You have monetarists who believe that recessions are caused by wrong monetary policy, mismanaging the money supply, demand side. You have Austrians who believe that recessions are caused by the central bank manipulating interest rate and money supply and distorting the structure of investment. Again, a demand theory. All major macroeconomic theories are demand theory, but for this one. Now, what is the explanation for this? Why would everyone then believe that recessions are demand driven if they are instead supply side driven? Their explanation is as follows. What's happening? Sorry. God is punishing me for torturing. Oh. The devil. Okay, so real business cycle, just 2 minutes. Torture, and it will be all. So you have a long run curve. Long run supply curve is determined by the real physical capabilities and productive efficiency of the economy. Everything from the it is supply side driven. Money doesn't have any influence over this curve here. Price level doesn't affect at all. So when something good happens, long run curve goes to the right. Technology, like agricultural, when in the Bronze Age people discovered crops, that's the long run supply curve of the primitive humanity 6,000 years ago, went way to the right. But the Second World War began and went in this direction. Although some historians don't believe it. Don't agree with this. They believe it. The Second World War saved us. Don't control that. At any rate, so the movements of the long run supply curve, left or right, actually showcase the changes in the real productive capacity of the economy, supply side. Here is the argument demand. So we can disregard temporarily the short-term fluctuations because they're manipulable by money supply. Just take a look at the relationship between demand and long-run supply. And what they say is actually, if for whatever reason, long-run supply curve moves to the left, something bad happens with the structure of production in the economy. Productive capacity of an economy is declining. This will be shown as a shift to the left. In the same time, the demand will be declining. Why the demand will be declining? Because as the supply declines, the price increases. With the same income in the short run, people will be buying less. Price is higher, you have the same income. So the demand will be going down as well. Those two things will happen at the same time. Now, why people believe, according to this argument, I'm not saying that it is correct. People look just at this, say, oh shoot, demand is increasing. It might be causing the problem. Whereas in reality, the decrease in demand is just an artifact, it's just an epiphenomenon of this drop in supply. It's undermining of the structure of production. Just like when you look at a patient and he has a fever, we have to cure fever. The problem is the patient has a flu or a coronavirus and so on. And you can put the patient in a bathtub with ice. That's their analogy to this idea of doing something about the demand to cure the business side. You're not treating the root cause. The root cause is the structural distortion in the economy, on the supply side, which is just manifested empirically for us as a decline in demand. The real problem is our oil embargo or something else is happening. The government locking down the entire economy in March 2020. That's the problem. You're gonna recover once you allow people to go back to work. You don't need to pay them $2 trillion to stay home. You know, that's the logic. Okay, final questions. Anything? Okay, great vision. Okay. I will post some stuff on the canvas in the meantime. For the assignments from after the midterm onwards, I will give you some answers about the questions of the homework assignments. Why certain questions should be answered in that way, especially for the essay questions. And okay, somebody asked about the final exam. The final exam will be online in the examination week last week. So material from after the meeting.
Figure it out.